listening to Your Music, Your Business, a podcast putting you in the room with music industry professionals so that you actually hear it first.
Hi everyone, today we are joined by Dr. Ben Eltham. He is a lecturer and research at Monash and a volunteer at CrewCare. Ben's pronouns are he, him. Welcome to the podcast, Ben.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
It's great to have you. Well, firstly, I'd love to start where I think, what will be the basis of this conversation today, and that is regarding CrewCare. Can you tell us a bit about what CrewCare is for those who are listening who have never heard about it and what you are doing there currently?
So CrewCare is a non-profit cultural organisation, and it exists to help performing arts workers, really. So I think it started up really in the period running into the pandemic, and I think it's really a pretty grassroots organisation that's been set up by some old roadies and some people who've worked on festivals and events, looking to help each other, provide support, particularly mental health support, but also I think just companionship and solidarity. They played a big role in helping those kind of people during the pandemic, which was obviously a devastating time for the sector, particularly for people who relied on working in live events. It was a very difficult time for working crew and roadies. They approached me about 18 months ago to do a little research project for them to look into the conditions of crew working in Australia, and also looking into what the organisation does, and maybe some ideas about where they could head in the future. So there was a survey that they conducted of members. It was about 300 workers that they surveyed, which I thought was a pretty interesting survey. Got some really interesting data together. And I also looked at some census data from the ABS and conducted some interviews with some people who work in the industry, and put together a little report for CrewCare. So, that was a really fun thing to work on, and I hope I was able to contribute a little bit to them.
Yeah, that's amazing. Can you tell me a little bit more about sort of what you were able to find through that study? Like what did you really focus on?
Look, I focused on really the workers themselves, what they were saying in the surveys and the interviews, their desires for the future, where they thought the industry was at, things that they think they need to get better, to improve, or maybe even just to stay in the industry. And I also crunched some earnings data, so looking at people's income and earnings as it was reported in the census. I did some demographics on the workforce, looking at age and gender, and we looked at some of the kind of the opinions that the workers had about the state of the industry. So it was a sort of like a workforce kind of report, really looking at this cohort of crew of performing arts workers, what they're doing, where they see the future, how they're feeling.
Wow, that's amazing, because that probably would have been almost an industry first. Would that be correct?
It hasn't really been done in Australia before, this kind of thing. Stuart Coupe wrote a very good book in 2018 about roadies, which I very much recommend. And there's been some high quality academic research in Canada and the UK on roadies and performing arts crew, but there hasn't been a lot in Australia. It's a relatively small field in terms of academic research. Got some wonderful colleagues across a couple of the universities, like Catherine Strong at RMIT, who are doing excellent work, but there's probably only a few people who are researching this stuff in Australia.
Yeah, which is absolutely wild, because this sort of research really does provide, so many different valuable outcomes for crew. Like, I can name so many, but probably the bigger one that I would be more focused on is crew actually feeling like they have a voice and that they've actually been heard, and that there's programs that can now be put in place because there is an understanding of what their voice truly is, not just an assumption.
I think historically crew haven't had much of a voice in the industry. Partly that's part of the culture of the scene. I mean, they are in many cases backstage.
Yes.
They're wearing the black t-shirts. They're stage managing. They're there before the show starts and after the show ends. And there's a culture in the industry, obviously, of celebrating artists and performers and putting the spotlight on them. But part of that has resulted in, I think, the workers in the industry not having a strong enough voice. So one of the things that I explore in the report is that workers in culture more generally, but particularly in this industry, they need a stronger voice. They need probably a union, or they need to join their existing union and probably try and get more collectively organised. That will enable them to bargain with employers for higher wages, which is the traditional job of a union, but it would also give them more of a voice in policy discussions and help them try and get more focus on some of those specific issues that they face, like mental health challenges.
Yeah, wow. I can imagine what sort of impact them having a union would be. And I think, in the music industry in particular, a lot of us joke about having a union because we think it would just be so valuable. And I shouldn't even say joke. Like, I think we say it in jest, but we're sort of hoping that someday it'll happen.
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? So one of the things that I explored in the report is, should CrewCare become a union? And the conclusion that I reached was no, that's not the job of an organisation like CrewCare. It's a big job being a union. It's a different legal structure as well. So it's not the structure of a non-profit. And, it's a difficult gig being in a union. I can tell you I'm involved, I'm quite heavily involved in the academic union at my university. And it can be pretty hostile, actually. So sitting across the table from your boss and asking for a pay rise is not an easy conversation. And so, you need to have a certain type of organisation that's prepared to do that. That in Australia, that's traditionally been unions. But what's happened over the last sort of 30, 40 years is that the density of unions in Australia has really dropped off. In fact, particularly badly in creative industries. So the creative industries workforce is very ununionised. It's only about 9% of all the workers are in a union, which is even lower than the broader Australian workforce. And that has a bunch of consequences. One of them is that there's not really much power that workers have, right? Particularly relating to their bosses. Now, some people even feel like this conversation is an unnecessarily adversarial one. There's a feeling that we're all in this together. The industry should grow. If the industry grows, then workers will get more of a share of that. And that's true, obviously. But there's also a distributional issue when it comes to earnings and share of money that goes to wages versus, the people who own the capital. If there isn't a sort of organisation or a collectivity that can work together to counterpose the power of the people who have the money and who are in control of the management, then what will happen is that those people will be deprioritised. This is true actually also for artists.
So definitely.
There's very big inequalities, particularly in the creative industries. There's some of the most unequal industries, actually, even more unequal than industries like the law or finance, surprisingly. And part of that sort of structure of these industries where we have a kind of winner takes all model. So for artists, for example, most artists don't make money out of their art. In fact, most artists are barely making, poverty wages and have to support themselves with other work. But there's a few superstars, obviously, who are doing quite well.
Always the exception to the rule. Yeah.
That's right. They are the exception. And they tend to vacuum up a lot of revenue in the industry. So that inequality is hurting a lot of their colleagues. And it's not as bad for crew and for performing arts workers, but considering how important they are to the industry, literally the show can't go on without crew, that they're probably in a position to drive a harder bargain, but that will take organisation and advocacy and willpower.
Yeah, definitely. And it would be so fascinating to see the impact of, having an organization or having a union even for crew and what that could really do. Like, I think, to really connect with my sector, we have an association of artist managers in Australia now, and just seeing the impact that they've been able to have on the industry in regards to advocacy and organizing us all together, and also, having flow-on impacts into artists' careers as well. It's been massive. Like, you couldn't even quantify, particularly over the last 5 years. And I think a really good, key example would be, say, like Michael's rule at the moment that they've, been able to push past, particularly in New South Wales. It's just, that will have a flow-on effect on this industry that we, don't even notice. And it'd be amazing to see what would happen if, crew were able to have that sort of impact as well, because you are the backbone. And it's amazing that we don't necessarily prioritize it that way. It's just mind-boggling, really.
I'm someone who studies the creative industries and I guess labour more generally. It's not surprising, actually. It's really common. So in most industries, the backbone of the industry are low-paid workers, right? The backbone of food delivery are low-paid workers. The backbone of education, believe it or not, are low-paid casual academics. So there's all sorts of industries where the backbone of the industry are low-paid workers, and that's because they don't have enough power, right? They're not able to negotiate a stronger position for themselves because they're not organised. Yeah, these are easy problems to diagnose, but hard problems to solve because they require a lot of work, hard work to try and redress these imbalances.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think this is the perfect time to sort of mention to our audience that you actually hold a PhD in cultural policy, this is why your brain works this way, and you see it, see these things that most of us don't even recognize around us. And I think I wanted to ask you, from your perspective on the cultural challenges that we face and that is affecting crew in the music industry. Is there anything in particular that you're seeing from a cultural policy perspective that would is really having an impact on crew, for a positive or a negative at the moment?
Yeah, so I came up in the industry, actually. I used to organise festivals, and I ran nightclubs for a while and was a promoter for a while. And then I did my PhD at Western Sydney Uni in cultural studies and cultural policy, and nowadays I'm teaching in cultural policy at Monash Uni. I kind of specialise in looking at Australian cultural policy. It's actually a bigger field than you think when you look at it. It gets into areas like media, copyright law, trade now, as we see increasingly in the Trump era. So yeah, it's a really interesting area. It's constantly changing. The biggest issue facing Australia's creative industries, and including music, maybe even especially music, is the dominance of international platforms. So we have allowed, really through, I think, laziness, or policymakers have been asleep at the wheel, we've allowed powerful international platforms like Spotify to dominate our music industry. And so now we've got a situation where a foreign company basically vacuums up the majority of the music revenue in this country. Some money does get paid back to labels and artists in the form of royalties and Spotify subscriptions, but not very much.
Comparatively.
Yeah, no, I'm sure I don't have to tell this audience that the earnings that people are making from streaming revenue is not very much. Once again, that's a power problem. Historically, labels were the organizations that had the most power, and they were able to drive relatively hard bargains with retailers and distributors, and some of that money flowed back to artists. What's happened in the streaming era is that an alliance between powerful tech companies and major labels, big international labels, has meant that the structure of the streaming industry is really divvied up in favour of a couple of big key players like the three major labels and Spotify itself. Right, that's been a disaster for Australian music. You can see it in the charts. If you look at the number of Australian songs in the ARIA charts, it's at an all-time low. It's now as bad as it was in the 1960s, or even worse. There are only 5 Australian songs in the top 100 last year and only 2 in the top 40. It's so bad, and ARIA has become so embarrassed by it that they're actually now changing the formula for the charts. That might make a difference, but I don't think it will. I don't think it will make a massive difference. And the reason is because they can change the way they measure the charts in inverted commas, right? But I don't know if it's going to really change listening dynamics, actually, because they're driven by the platform, right? Not by the charts.
Yeah. And the algorithm that then is pushing people. It's funny, I'm actually doing some research into this at the moment, which I'll probably share with the listeners in a few episodes time. But it is amazing how much we don't realize how much the algorithms and within those platforms are really influencing people's music tastes, basically.
Massively influencing. It's very, very significant. And so I think we need laws. We need laws to safeguard Australian content on streaming platforms. Now, if you go back 30, 40 years, we used to have those laws. They were called local content laws. If you wanted to be an Australian television network, right, you had to play a certain amount of Australian produced content, right? Same with the Australian radio stations. Terrestrial radio still supposedly has local content rules, although we know that they regularly rort them. Streaming platforms have no local content requirements whatsoever. So, in fact, they don't even break out how much Australian content is played on Spotify. So we don't truly know how much Australian music is streamed on Spotify to Australian audiences. Anecdotally, we think it's very low, in the low single figures, so less than 10%. But we don't actually know that because they won't tell us. So that would be, in my opinion, the single biggest issue in cultural policy at the moment, and something I actually campaigned on through a group called Save Our Arts in the run-up to the federal election.
Wow. Yeah, it's just that alone has just such a ripple effect on our industry as well. And thankfully there are some people like yourselves who are doing some research into that. Like I know Tim Kelly, who we're going to have on the podcast soon.
He's done some great work.
Some amazing work. It's just every time he talks about it, I'm just shocked. He's actually a colleague of mine at AIM, so we constantly talk about his research. And was like, what can I tell people? What can I tell people? But it's amazing, the flow-on effect that these sorts of decisions and lack of laws have on our industry, realistically.
Yeah, it's a policy problem. We need our politicians to act. In fact, it was an election promise back in 2022 from the, as it was then, incoming Albanese government. So Tony Burke, the arts minister, got up on stage at the Woodford Folk Festival in early 23 and promised a local content quota. He's never delivered that for whatever reason, and I think it's time that the industry actually started to put the heat on. This is now the second term of the Albanese government. What are they going to do? Are they going to do it? Yep. They had 3 years. They didn't put it in the last term. In that time, it's only got worse. The problem's only got bigger. I won't be too critical of the federal government because they have tipped a bit of money into things like Music Australia, which is a new kind of body that they've set up within Creative Australia, the Old Australia Council. So there's a more kind of industry focus to music policy at a federal level, which I think is cautiously optimistic.
Yes.
Millie Milgate is the boss of Music Australia. She's a veteran in the industry, so she knows how it works. She's been around the block. She knows a lot of people. So that's good, I think, and she's someone who's approachable and people can talk to her, and that's not something you normally get with a federal bureaucrat. So that's good. They've got a bit of money, but, it's not what I would call the kind of money that would be required to really kickstart, let's say, an export boom for Australian music. If you look at what other countries are doing in this scene, there's lots of opportunities. The Koreans famously funded a massive cultural export program that they called the Hallyu, or sometimes called the Korean Wave. Now, a lot of people wonder whether that kind of thing could be replicated in other countries. The jury's out, actually. The Japanese tried and maybe didn't quite succeed, although Japan's obviously very, very productive in terms of culture. we haven't really started. We've got like
No.
a few small export programs. We send a few artists to South by Southwest. We fund a few labels to do a little bit of this and that, but it's chump change, really. Australia doesn't take the creative industries as industries seriously. And if we wanted to, there's actually a lot we could do. Now, I don't think that's the reason to fund art and culture, by the way. I think the reason to fund art and culture is because they're part of who we are as human beings, and they have a kind of value that transcends the mere economy. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't also be supporting things like music exports, local content, artists themselves. I don't think there's nearly enough support for artists, to make work, to be musicians. It's very hard to get a grant just to say, like, I want to be a muso and I want to put out a couple of albums. You can't really get a grant for that. And why not? What's wrong with that? Like, what if those albums turn out to be like life-changing experiences for their listeners? So there's a missing part of cultural policy in Australia too, which is audiences. Culture is part of what it is to be a human being. Art and music make people happy. They reach us in a deeply spiritual way. They touch our emotions. They give us a reason to live in many cases. So there's some of the most, in my opinion, there's some of the highest goals the government could achieve in terms of policy. And I guess that's why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Yeah. Oh, Ben, can I just say amen to that? Like, I have been waiting for somebody to come on this podcast and say exactly all of those things, because you are so right. Like, I think it's something that everybody's thinking, but nobody's actively saying. And I think, providing that sort of context for people in industry, but also out of industry, is sometimes the part that we're missing. It's like, this is the entire reason, guys. Like, this is why we want advocacy. This is why we want more people to be, looking towards advocacy and using their voice realistically. And you summed it up so well. So I'm so glad I have you on the podcast. Thank you. Well, I think, probably that's a really great direction towards looking into some of the research you've been conducting at Monash. And like, I know we talked before the podcast about some of the current research you're doing, and obviously we've talked about some of the past research you're doing. What are you finding are key problem spaces in and around skills in the workforce, and for crew, but then also for music industry, if you've been able to look into that? What have you been mostly focused on?
It's been an informal industry for a long time, really. Like, if you talk to some of the old crew, like the old roadies, a lot of them got into the industry with no training. They just, there was a gig on down the road, their mate said, can you help do the sound, right? And so for many, many years, there weren't many formal training kind of arrangements in the industry. That has changed, and now we have started to establish like proper, technical colleges. You can go to uni, you can go to TAFE, you can get specialist education at places. So that's very positive, but I still think there's a skill shortage in the industry. And this is very apparent coming out of the pandemic, where so many people had left the industry or been forced to leave the industry, maybe is a better way to say it. But, a lot of them didn't come back. I remember talking to a mate of mine who was a soundie. He went and got a job as a landscape gardener during the pandemic, and he didn't come back. He liked it. He's like, I like working outdoors. Like, I can see the sky. I can see the sun and when I'm at work, that's quite nice. I'm sick of working in a dark room. Also, I'm getting paid more, right? So, I think a lot of people during the pandemic were forced to work in industries outside of the creative industries, and they realized that conditions were better and pay was higher. And so there's been an exodus of skilled workers out of the sector that was particularly apparent, I think, in 22, 23. That's started to equalize up a bit now, I think. I don't think it's quite as acute as it was a couple of years ago, but there's no doubt that for particularly in specialist disciplines like specialist lighting, specialist, rigging in particular, those kind of skills and occupations in the creative sector that are also exposed to the building trades, that it's very hard for the sector to meet the kind of wages that can be paid in construction. So if you can rig, why would you work on a music festival for a lot less money than you could get paid, working on the Northwest Link or whatever you're working on?
Yeah.
So that's a problem for the sector. There's also a problem with the culture of the sector, ironically, the small C culture, you might say. Over many, many years, the workplace culture in creative industries, particularly in the live sector, was long hours, by definition, late nights. Often people weren't getting paid by the hour. They might be getting paid by the job or by the day. And this incentivized employers to keep people working for hours longer than they probably needed to be. There are well-documented safety issues within the industry. It's not necessarily a safe workplace, and that's not just in terms of the physical risks, but there are now emerging lots and lots of data showing that there's big issues in terms of the psychological risks of this workplace.
Oh yeah, lots of data coming out around that at the moment.
Yep. So these are all issues that confront cultural workers and in particular crew, and they're well aware of that. So that came through in the survey. People understand that there are issues, there are real problems. For some people, even though they love the work that they do, they're going to have to leave because they've got a family, or they just realize it's not sustainable to live this lifestyle for years into the future. People burn out, or people simply get sick, actually. Yeah, so these are big issues. They need to be confronted not just by the workers, but by the managers, the owners of these organizations that are employing people. That a little bit of that work has started to be done, but I still think there's a long road to go there.
Yeah, it's so hard, particularly when so much of it is contract work as well, where it's, some crew just don't even know what they're going to be doing, in a few months for financial stability as well, and the sort of impact that can have.
Let's talk about that. So we call that insecurity in the literature, right? Or precarity, even, to be precarious, right? And it's rampant in these industries. And it's a real problem. It's a problem for the people who have to work in these industries. For some younger workers, it's attractive to have a lifestyle where they've got a lot of options and they can work on a job here or a job there and go traveling in between. But I think particularly as people get older, maybe they take on family responsibilities, or they just realize that, they're not getting any younger. Maybe they want to buy a house. Maybe they just want to have a shot at a decent retirement. For all of these reasons, job insecurity is a big problem for workers. It's also a big problem for the industry. It leads to rapid turnover of staff. It leads to a lack of productivity, in my view. People are constantly needing to be trained because skilled workers are leaving, new people are coming on. That affects all sorts of operations and safety. But because it's cheap and because it's just always been like that, the industry has kind of been run on a kind of just-in-time, insecure kind of model. The old joke that everyone always likes to say this time is like, oh, it's the original gig work, which is true, right? I mean, I think technically the original gig work was probably jazz musos in Harlem or whatever, but these industries have been run on an insecure basis, on a casual basis, really from the beginning. And in Australia in 2025, I don't think that's good enough.
Oh, exactly. And I think, it does have such a ripple effect across our industry that we're not even comprehending, I think, as an industry. And, I think we started to comprehend a little bit when we saw that mass exodus during, post-COVID and everything. And we were all just like, what do you mean we don't have a sound engineer for this show? And we have to pay 3 or 4 times what we would have previously to have somebody who was, in some cases overqualified for the job because they were the only person that was available, or, as a really niche example, because that happened to me. But then also, sometimes, their prices went up, fair enough, and rightfully so. And that had an impact on the band that I was managing, or the show, or whatever, and the flow and effect that has. And it should be the case realistically. But it is fascinating to now have data that really does show that. And I think, what I'd love to ask you then is sort of, what are you seeing in regards to the responses of this data? Like, do you think that if we just highlight the, job insecurity side of things, do you think that there is an appetite within this industry for change to work towards, more stable career opportunities? So, people being hired part-time or full-time over, contract work. Is there any appetite for it at the moment that you're seeing?
Yes, I do see that actually, which is great. And it's definitely a bit of a green shoot. So some of the members of the CrewCare board are also, working in the industry. They might even be running small to medium, crew organizations or event companies. They're trying really hard on this stuff, actually. They're trying really hard to improve their employment practices, give people more secure work. That's really positive. There are also green shoots, I think, in terms of the sort of legislation. So I've just given Tony Burke a bit of a kicking, but, in his capacity as employment minister, he pushed through a bunch of pro-worker legislation through the parliament that has actually really improved wages and conditions, particularly for insecure workers. So that's a tick. So it's now harder for employers to put people on fake ABNs and say, oh, you're just a contractor. That kind of sham contracting is getting harder now. There's also more understanding, I think, in the sector that stuff is coming to an end, that model is not going to be legally defensible very long. Things like superannuation, which has long been just an open sore in the sector, people just not getting paid super. That's now being cracked down on by the ATO, and so it's getting harder for employers to not pay their workers super. That's really positive. So it's not all bad.
We have to try and remember that sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So much of it, the focus goes back on to, but we haven't done this and we haven't done that, and these are still important. But there are some small wins we're getting, right?
There are some small wins. The consequences of that, as you point out rightly, are going to be higher wages, actually, and therefore higher costs for event companies and promoters. And that's going to have to flow through the industry, which is already struggling with pricing power. Young consumers out of the market, or there's been a cost of living crisis, and I think it's been hard for a lot of punters to go and see shows. There's a bunch of complexities in the industry. There's headwinds, as the economists say. I don't think they're insurmountable, and the one really killer advantage that the sector has is it's got a great product. Okay, so it's got potentially life-changing experiences. We've just seen 200,000 people rock up to Glastonbury. Clearly, there's still an appetite for large-scale music. There's still an appetite for small-scale music, in my opinion, although a lot of the smaller venues are struggling. But I think there's still a lot of opportunity for the sector to grow. And hopefully as the economy recovers, particularly the consumer economy, people will start to climb out of the hole. Circling back to the policy discussion, we need stronger policy to set a direction for the industry that, it's possible to imagine an industry with better security, better wages, musicians getting paid properly. Maybe tickets have to be a bit more expensive in that new model, but also maybe some of the wealth in the industry needs to be redistributed away from the big players and towards the smaller players. That's going to require political courage. And that in turn is going to require artists, workers, musicians working together to advocate, to lobby for a better future.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, I feel like we're almost ready to sing Kumbaya. It's great. Well, yeah, I think that's such a good segue into probably more of what I wanted to discuss too, is sort of, what sort of hope are you seeing for support or funding or programming or / upskilling, particularly, for crew or, in the sort of fields that you're researching at the moment? Because I know at the moment you're doing some research into AI, which is not necessarily a field that feels like it's got much hope, but is there anything that you're seeing?
Yeah, well, it's a finely balanced moment, right? Like, I think you can see the potential for a new model emerging that is more positive and more secure, but you can also see some potentially big risks. AI is probably the biggest one. I know many people in the industry are deeply concerned about the rise of generative models, particularly in music. They're already taking jobs. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
Composers, particularly in film scores, are getting smashed by these models, which can just sort of churn out, quite convincing sounding incidental music for productions. Voiceover artists are now having their voices stolen by models and used to narrate audiobooks and things like that. I talked to a voiceover artist the other day who had that happen to them.
Wow.
So it's real. It's here now. It's only going to get worse. As we saw with platforms, the technology's controlled by a handful of multi-billionaires. They don't seem to care very much about the laws of any country. They're driven by grandiose dreams of colonizing Mars. There's a kind of quite a dark aspect to technology in 2025. It's interesting that they started with the creative industries, really, and there seems to be no interest in the rights of artists or the welfare of audiences. It's just a race towards what they see as some kind of utopia of technology. We should all be very concerned about that. And the track record of policymakers in responding to these technological challenges has been poor, as we've seen with streaming. They didn't react to the rise of streaming platforms or social media. And as a result, we have a whole bunch of problems in our society, in our industry right now. So, I don't think we're ready to sing Kumbaya at all, actually. I think it's a relatively not bleak time, but it's certainly, you can see a lot of risks on the horizon. Circling back to your question about training, though, that is probably a brighter spot. I think there are now starting to emerge more programs to train people. That was one of the highlights of the work that I looked at that CrewCare are doing. They're doing actual industry placements for young and emerging crew, and they've been super successful, as you might expect, because it's a hands-on industry. So giving younger workers actual real life on the job experience turns out to be the most valuable thing. Yes, you can go and do a course and you can learn, audio acoustics or whatever is the sort of technical side of your profession, your occupation, but nothing replaces hands-on experience. So providing pathways for younger workers into the industry turns out to be really important. Again, because of the structure of the industry was so informal for so long, there haven't ever even really been apprenticeships in the creative industries in the way that there are in other sort of hands-on sectors. So this is the beginning of on-the-job training in the sector. I think CrewCare has done a really good job there with that one.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that is going to have such a huge impact, just, hands-on apprenticeships and experiences. It has a flow-on effect. You look at that in another 10 years and that sort of program is sort of just ripples out realistically across the industry, and also helps people, build connections and networks even quicker, which is realistically the strength of this industry, whether we like it or not. And that in turn then helps people to feel more empowered about their own voices, because the more that we talk about, the issues that we're facing, the more that we realize that we probably actually could stand together and discuss it to solve it realistically. So that's super exciting. And I think, to circle back to the AI research you're doing, I think for me, at least, it feels like, even though statistically or historically from experience, our policymakers haven't actually understood the impact that, streaming or social media has had as it's sort of grown through our culture and across our industry. It actually sort of gives me hope that people like yourself are starting the research on it already, so that there is a little bit more of information for policymakers, so that there's sort of no excuses for them, hopefully.
I think information, unfortunately, is only one part of the equation. A more important aspect is lobbying and building the power. There used to be a big fad, 10 years ago for a thing called evidence-based policy. A lot of people used to talk about that, just give policymakers the evidence and then they'll be better informed and they'll make better policy. Yeah, it turned out to be a little bit more complex than that, because policymakers actually don't necessarily act on the evidence, right? They act on the political imperatives or what the minister tells them to do. And if the minister is busy elsewhere or doesn't care or hasn't had a look at it, or had a very nice swanky dinner with an important industry CEO recently who told that minister what to do, then those are the kind of signals that end up affecting policy rather than the best evidence. So, you know, and I think this is one area where the industry has been very underpowered in Australia for a long time. So the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, which is the main union in the sector, is the smallest union. It's pretty underpowered. It doesn't have a big voice. There's still no chamber of culture or kind of large-scale industry lobby for the creative industries in Australia. As a result, a lot of the lobbying gets done by some of the sort of silos, if you like, or some of the specific industry bodies. So APRA AMCOS have a lot of sway in Canberra because they're the richest lobby group. But they don't really represent the whole sector.
No.
It's just one part of it, right?
Yeah.
So that's an issue. And there hasn't been a lot of sophisticated work done on advocating for the broader importance of culture, you know, in the broader sense, in the intellectual and almost spiritual aspects that I talked about before. So yeah, it's a big job actually. You know, that what's required is not just more organization, but more money and more willpower.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, to really acknowledge it, you know, we do have some listeners who are from around the world, and I know in other countries some of the policy making is even more complex and more of a headache for a lot of industries. And then in others they've really been able to push through. Like, you know, I can't even imagine the impact that the sort of money that the Korean government, you know, invested in export would have, you know, if we invested the same in Australia, like as we discussed. Like, it would just be groundbreaking.
Well, be careful what you wish for, because the Korean experience is really interesting, because most of that money went to the big major labels there, right? So it went to the big K-pop labels. That's where that money went. So it hasn't filtered down to ordinary musicians in Korea, okay? Yes, they've got BTS. Yes, they've got Blackpink. But at the grassroots of Korean music, there's nothing like that kind of level of support. So, you know, I often think we need to understand this stuff better before we advocate for it. You know, it's one thing to say, oh yeah, like music exports, that's the future. That'll be great. We're going to be like Korea. We're going to be like Sweden. But if the structure of the global music industry is about superstars and about a few very, very successful artists who are able to enjoy untold wealth, where does that leave ordinary working musicians? Where does that leave crew in Australia? Where does that leave audiences?
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, really looking into how much of an impact monopolistic practices have across our industry is, that's a whole other episode.
It's massive. Yeah. I mean, and one of the biggest aspects that is not looked at in Australia on any level is competition policy. Now, we have allowed our touring industry to now become dominated by two companies. That's a duopoly. Now, in many countries, a duopoly is broken up by the competition regulator, but in Australia, we seem to be very comfortable with duopolies and oligopolies. So we don't seem to have any concerns about two supermarkets controlling the supermarket industry or two airlines controlling our airline industry. So I guess we also have no problems with two events companies controlling most of our live entertainment industry as well.
Yep. And I'm going to leave that one there because that is a whole other episode, which for the listeners, I'm trying to find somebody who's the best place to talk to about that, because I think it needs to be said. There needs to be somebody in the room at the moment having that discussion and, you know, sharing the multiple complex experiences that, you know, that really does impact. But
the Australian Institute's done a bit of work on oligopoly and market concentration. So, but you're right, it's hard for people within the industry to talk about this stuff because they're dependent on some of these big companies for their wages or for their incomes or to put on that next show. And this is the problem of market power, of course. This is why it's difficult to break up these concentrated market dominant firms, precisely because it's not just about the money that they make, but it's about the sort of power networks that they build.
Yeah, definitely. And, I've seen it firsthand with this podcast, even of, platforms like Spotify, and trying to have people who've exited, talk to their experiences, and they can't because they have them in a chokehold. So it's, very fascinating.
Well, Spotify, I'm prepared to talk about Spotify, but yeah, I once talked to a whistleblower within Spotify, and it was exactly that issue. That person had all sorts of gossip about the internal workings of Spotify, just how little Australian content was prioritized, how few Australians work for Spotify. Like the local office of Spotify is like about 7 people, right?
Which is just wild.
Yeah. Yeah, it is, well, especially when you consider how many people worked in, say, radio stations 20 years ago, for example. Yeah. Thousands, actually. People are reluctant to speak for obvious reasons. They want to have careers. They don't want to upset the apple cart. That's one responsibility of academics, actually, and journalists is to speak up, because our role is to be independent and to be able to say things that other people aren't able to.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, this was an amazing episode. We really unpacked a lot, and it would be interesting, for our listeners, if you've got some questions for Ben, feel free to send them through to me, and I'll forward them on, and we can see what we can help pull apart. It's one of those, like, you pull the end of the string and all of a sudden it's like your mind is running wild with all these different things that we could do for this industry, which can be really exciting. And I suppose, it really does draw me back to the base of what we really try to focus on in this industry, which is thinking long term. And our question that we always throw to the end of the episode, which is, when you're 90 years old in a retirement home and wanting to brag to your room neighbor about what you did during your long life, what would you like to say to them?
Well, yeah, I had to think about it. This is quite a hard question, actually.
It is.
I think, like, ultimately, I'd like to be able to say I'd lived a rich life, and that includes family. I'd like to be able to say that I've been a good father and a good partner, but also I'd like to be able to say that I've contributed something to the world in a positive way, whether that be in my work, trying to help people as a journalist, as a unionist, and indeed as a writer. So I'm really hoping that I'll be able to say that I've written a couple more books by the time I'm 90.
I love that.
this is probably a good kick up the bum that you've asked me this question, actually.
Yeah, you've said it now, and it's going to be out in the universe as well. There'll be other people that can keep you accountable.
Correct. Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Oh, too good. Well, thank you so much for your insight today, Ben. It was great to have you, and hopefully the episode today really got some people excited to think about their industry and what's impacting them, and use their voice.
Well, look, I just want to finish off by saying, like, cultural workers are really important parts, not just of their industry, but of all of our lives. And, I think it's high time that we paid more attention to cultural workers, to the work that they do, to the joy that they bring, to the experiences that they enable. So I was very pleased to work with CrewCare on this report, because I don't think there's enough attention given to the work, to the contribution of cultural workers, especially crew. So more power to the crew, basically.
Amen. More power to the crew. Thanks, Ben.